Welcome into the Big City Sports Podcast. We have another episode coming up, going to touch on the sticky and terrible situation going on with the Chicago Blackhawks organization, and also talking about the New York Islanders' exit from the playoffs, obviously in Game 7. So two down situations that we're talking about today, one a lot more serious than the other. But before we get into those, Swig, how you doing?
I'm good, man. Yeah, I know this. It's a bit of a depressing note to open the episode on, and just to warn everyone, this will probably be a bit of a shorter episode, but we don't want to take the allegations lightly here. And anyone who doesn't know about the Blackhawks situation, we'll explain that here shortly. But it's not good. And while we prefer to keep this more upbeat and lighthearted and humorous, sometimes there are situations that need to be discussed. We did it with the Tony D'Angelo situation, for example. And it's sport. Life isn't perfect. Sports aren't always going to be sunshine and lollipops. So when something like that happens, we need to address it. So, but we do think it's very important. So it's not the most uplifting situation in the world, but want to make sure we got to report this seriously as well. So we'll get into it. I'm not saying I'm looking forward to it, but I think it needs to be addressed.
100% it needs to be addressed, and it doesn't need to just be addressed by us here at the Big City Sports Podcast. It's got to be addressed by everybody in the National Hockey League, everyone needs to know about this situation because it is horrible, it's disgusting, it's nasty. And before we dive into it, I'm going to dive into it right now. So the Chicago Blackhawks situation, they had a video control coach named Brad Aldrich, who was a part of the staff. And he allegedly actually raped two players. There's just two that they're coming out right now on the hockey team in 2010 of the Stanley Cup winning Blackhawks team. He raped two hockey players on that team. And it's just not a good situation at all. And before we dive into the nitty gritty of what all took place, what's your reaction to that horrific news?
I mean, it's fucked up. Anyone who doesn't have that reaction is frankly just not taking it seriously enough. I'm not going to insult you. It needs to be taken seriously. And this news broke about a week, maybe 10 days ago. And if this is the first you're hearing of it, don't feel bad. You're not alone. It's not being reported really. So I know a lot of Blackhawks fans. I know you're one of them, but I know a lot of Blackhawks fans up here who heard it for the first time from me. Yeah, so I like to think of myself as a good source and all, but that's an issue. It shouldn't. This should be news a lot further than we're reporting it. So let's dive into what we know. So Brad Aldrich, like you said. So from what I understand, the phrase that I read was allegedly sexually assaulted two players on that 2010 Stanley Cup winning team. Now they were those two players, one of who is suing the Blackhawks. They reported this to then mental skills coach Paul Vincent. And I'm going to be reading off my notes here because I want to make sure I get the details right. So Vincent, the mental skills coach, this was before the Western Conference Finals against the Sharks, from my understanding that year. Vincent reported it to four key figures in the organization. First one was the then president, John McDonough, who was fired in April of last year. The other three are still with the organization. That's GM Stan Bowman, vice president of hockey operations, Al McIsaac, and sports psychologist, James Gary. Paul Vincent wanted them to report this incident to Chicago police, essentially saying, imagine if this was your son or daughter that this happened to, but they refused to do so. And they ended up winning the Stanley Cup. And then Aldrich, got pictures with the cup and everything, was part of the celebration, and then left to pursue other employment opportunities. He eventually went to the Miami of Ohio in college for about 4 months. From what we know, we don't know of anything that happened there specifically yet. But the Blackhawks, after he left the team or was fired or whatever, gave him positive references. After his brief stint at Miami of Ohio, Aldrich went to a Michigan high school as an assistant coach of some kind and eventually sexually assaulted a 17-year-old player on that team and spent 9 months in jail, and he's a registered sex offender. So the situation is horrifying. It was bad enough with the Blackhawks, and because they didn't take the action, it got a lot worse. So that's the bare bones of it. We'll get into it a little bit more. But for anyone who doesn't know, that is the main situation that we're going to address today, and that's why we're taking it so seriously. This is completely fucked up, and it needs to be way bigger news than it is.
And even on that report, they came out and said that he tried some things with some interns. He tried things with interns, just trying to. He invited players over to his hotel room and had cocktails as he said he'd invite them over to watch March Madness or any sort of event that was taking place. Just come over, watch the game. We'll have fun. And what happened was the drinks he gave them apparently had some sort of spike to them that allowed him to take advantage of both players. And I mean, right now it's 2 players that have been reported, but they said that he's done it with interns, bringing interns over. So you don't know what's going on in this guy's mind. He sounds like a very scary person out there right now. And just the actions that he has prescribed. And I just can imagine, or I can't imagine being a hockey player on a Blackhawks organization that's about ready to win a Stanley Cup and is set up for huge success, being a part of that, being excited to play with your teammates, and having something like that happen to one of your teammates in the locker room. It's got to be horrible from the player side of things.
It absolutely is, but I'm not here to blame any other players. Or the person who deserves the most blame is obviously Brad Aldrich for being the person who's sexually assaulting people. But there's a lot of blame to go around, and anyone who is complicit in allowing it to keep happening, or that eventually allowed it to happen to a child in Michigan, they deserve a lot of blame and criminal charges as well. But I mean, it eventually came out as well that this was basically an open secret in the organization. So it wasn't just those 4 guys. Now, I understand that the front office president, whoever, I can understand the logic to an extent. They should be the ones to report it, I guess. Maybe. I guess what is more important is that somebody fucking reports it. It needs to be reported, right? I don't want to make comparisons to other situations. Every case like this is different, but they all need to be taken seriously. You could go back to the Penn State situation where it was reported to the higher ups, Joe Paterno, whoever, wasn't reported there, and then they eventually lost their jobs, right? This one coach, found out about it, was disgusted, reported it to other, front office members. They decided not to report it. And it's just now becoming news 11 years later. I mean, you can see the predatory culture here. I have no doubt that Brad Aldrich targeted these players who I'm guessing were vulnerable with their roster spots, not trying to assume anything. I'm guessing he knew who he might be able to get away with this with, if that makes sense. I don't have any evidence to back that up yet, but just we've seen that pattern with similar cases. And then, I mean, I got to ask you about the Blackhawks response, because so far their lawyers have just said this case should be thrown out because the statute of limitations expired. To me, that's complete fucking bullshit. I'm not going to just sugarcoat this in any way. To me, that's a stupid law. I know it might technically be accurate, but just because it happened more than 10 years ago doesn't mean it's not a big deal, in my opinion.
100%. I agree with you there. And Stan Bowman should have been fired minus 10 years ago. Simple as that. How this guy still has a job. Now, this is completely off ice. I'm not talking anything that he's put on the ice. Now, Stan Bowman, knowing of this situation, still finding a way to craft this roster the way that he did and still run the organization the way that he has, even with McDonough there. McDonough was there until last year. So that's when he left. So both were a part of this organization for a while. And it was a disaster from the start on how no one even took this seriously enough to just find a way to let people know about this situation. Everyone knows in the locker room what's going on. Everyone knows in the organization between the walls what is going on with this case and with this everything going around with Brad Aldrich and what all takes place when he invites people over or anything that happens in those scenarios. They should have reported it from the start. And the way that they're sort of backing up and backing their toes into this situation tells me they're still not taking this issue seriously and that they're still going to end up having their jobs.
Yeah, that's definitely a big concern. That and that nothing's going to happen. There's not going to be any accountability. That's what everyone's looking for here, right? It's just it really is absurd. It seems like so far, at least, the Blackhawks and the NHL as well, who have had barely any comment on it. We'll get into that in a minute. Are just kind of hoping this will get blown swept under the rug, and that it'll eventually go away. And sadly, there is a chance that happens, but I want to make sure, at least as much as we can, that that's not the case. I don't want that to be the case. I'm sure you don't either. But one of the worst details I read was the support psychologist, the James Gary guy, supposedly blamed the players for getting assaulted,
Ooh.
which is, I hope that's not true. But even if it's not, this is still, completely despicable regardless. But from what I understand, he made it sound to them that it was their fault that this happened to them, which is never the case in any sexual assault situation. I want to make that clear right now. But not reporting it is shitty enough. But victim shaming or victim blaming is just completely unforgivable and unacceptable. And the fact that it's taken 11 years for this to come out, and 3 of the 4 guys who this was reported to still have jobs, that's amazing to me. And I think it really just shows the culture of secrecy and even maybe a predatory culture that exists in the NHL this whole time. I don't think this is the only situation in sports like this, but it's one of the first ones to come to light in one of the 4 major leagues.
Yeah, I think right now there's no chance that you have to remove Brad Aldrich's name from the Stanley Cup in 2010. I don't care what he gave with the effort of that team. If his name's on the Stanley Cup, you got to find a way to remove that. I mean, I don't want any association with him with the organization ever again, but his name's going to be attached to it for years to come. Honestly, as bad as this sounds as a Blackhawks fan, I hope that his name is attached to the Blackhawks organization, and I hope that this gets national recognition because I don't want this to be hidden. I want everyone in the world to know what the heck's going on with the Chicago Blackhawks and what took place, because I don't care if it makes me look like I'm a bad fan. It's like basically, no, I'm not going to compare that. That's absolutely insane. But you look at the Blackhawks situation, and I feel like it's much more important to spread the word and let people know that this is happening in professional sports, or at least in one occurrence, and let everyone know about that, as opposed to hiding in my own identity, which the way the Blackhawks are approaching the scandal right now is the same exact situation. So I hate what the Blackhawks are doing about it right now to the public.
And it absolutely does not make you a bad fan. Anyone who says that is just a coward. Okay. We don't support that here on this podcast, and we don't support it as human beings either. Okay. If the Blackhawks are covering this up, or pressuring people not to come forward, or whatever the situation is, not only are they trying to avoid accountability, but they're also influencing people who are not in the NHL or professional sports, who are victims of similar situations. They might be influencing them to keep their mouths shut too, which is not a good thing. It's completely unacceptable. So I don't want to hypothesize too much, but you have to take it that seriously. You have to apply a situation like this, which is on such a big scale, to the lesser reported situations amongst everyday people all over the world. It does have a ripple effect, and a bad one. It sets a bad example and a bad message. So I definitely hope we can agree on that. And it's just, we want to see some transparency here. Eventually, excuse me, the Blackhawks said they would be launching an independent investigation. If it's truly independent, that's great. We need to be kept informed. Now, the players themselves have not identified themselves. It's 100% their right. It does not matter who was assaulted. The fact that what matters is that the assaults occurred. We need to find out if that is true. For now, these are alleged incidents, but there definitely seems to be a lot of truth behind it. And this seems to be a really, really deep secret. So, and then one other aspect of it I wanted to touch on is how it's being reported or not being reported on in the media and in national news. And, right now, the NBC Sports is the primary television provider of NHL games. That won't be true for much longer. They're going to ESPN and TNT next year. Have you heard a word of it during any of the Stanley Cup playoffs? Because I haven't. And I want just one thing to speculate. Patrick Sharp, who was a member of that 2010 team, is one of NHL's anchors in the studio. Do you think that has anything to do with why it's not being reported?
I don't necessarily think that Patrick Sharp alone is the reason they're not reporting it. I think now Patrick Sharp, you could also find a way to work around his shifts. If you wanted to leak the information, let someone else break the news and not have Sharp working when it happens. But regardless, you have to take your own journalistic credibility in that situation if you're Patrick Sharp and still be able to report on this issue. But as a whole, when you look for something that happens in professional sports, especially with the Blackhawks and what's going on here, you look to the PR department, and that's where it all starts. It starts when you get that initial release message from an organization, and when you're not getting anything in any sort of clarity behind the whole situation, it's hard to report what you're reporting. You want to be 100% accurate when you spread the word to everybody else. So if you go to the source, to the PR department, and there's nothing released, it's going to be tough to find legit 100% credible, accurate information to provide to the people at home.
No, there's no question about it. There's so many layers to this situation. So I'm not trying to say it's only because Patrick Sharp is on the network or anything, but I have to wonder if that's a factor. And we're not hearing it much of it on any other major networks either. And the NHL itself, Gary Bettman's only comments on it were because he addresses, has a media address before game one of the Stanley Cup Finals every year. And at that address, he was asked a couple questions about it, and he dodged it and had some pretty terrible answers. And it's kind of predictable knowing his pattern. I mean, the NHL, I'm a huge hockey fan, my favorite sport. It's the worst run league of the major sports. So I'm not trying to compare scandals to each other, but you look at the difference in the outrage at the Astros scandal, right? Yes, that was bad. This is so much worse. They are not even comparable situations. Cheating is bad. Covering up sex crimes is a lot worse. Okay, it goes a lot deeper than what happens on the field or on the ice. So yeah, I'm not saying that outrage against that isn't warranted, but let's also remember what's more important at the end of the day here. So I'm hoping that we get some updates, we get some accountability, we get some actual transparency, but I haven't seen anything so far that has made me think that that's going to happen. The Blackhawks did a lot to cover this up. They didn't say anything. They didn't report anything to police. Then the video coach eventually, this leads to a horrible crime against a 17-year-old in Michigan. It's such a horrifying and entirely avoidable situation. And it really is just shameful. And I'm curious to see if this leads to other allegations or stories coming out across sports.
Yeah, it should. Hopefully. I'd hate to see things like this, but they do end up need to be reported, because if they're covered up, then it doesn't do anybody any good. It keeps it in, and that's not a good way to go about it. So Blackhawks situation was definitely a tough one, and it's still ongoing. We'll provide more updates as it comes in throughout the coming weeks here on the show, and hopefully that this story ends up taking some national recognition, and the Blackhawks end up at least saying factual information that comes out and just provides everybody with an update. But one positive update that the Blackhawks did get today was their captain, Jonathan Toews, took back to the practice ice. He finally found his way back to the facility. So that was good on him. And it was nice to see the captain back out there. I mean, he suffered from the illness and found a way to get back out there on the ice.
Absolutely. I mean, it's okay to be happy for him and still be disgusted with the rest of the organization. That is perfectly fine if anyone's worried about that. I'm curious to see what happens when he gets back on the ice. We're not trying to take attention away from everything we just discussed, but want to report on everything else at least a little bit as well here briefly. Hoping that he continues to recover. I'm glad that he prioritized his health over hockey this past season. Similar to what we just talked about, there's definitely things that are more important. That mental and physical health is absolutely on the list. So I wish him the best in that situation, and I'm curious to see how he does when he does get back on the ice.
Yeah, and don't want to not mention this as we transition over to the Islanders in New York. Your guy, Adam Fox, defenseman of the New York Rangers, took home the Norris Trophy for the best defenseman in the league. What are your thoughts, real quick, on that?
Oh man, it really is cool. Only his second full season. It's a well-earned honor. I can understand if anyone argues Cale Makar instead. That's a legitimate debate, but it goes to show what a great player Adam Fox already is this quickly in his career. I think Bobby Orr is the only other defenseman who ever won it within his first 2 seasons. So that's some pretty lofty company. I'm hoping that Adam Fox continues to build off of it and grow and go from there. But congrats to him. It's an amazing achievement.
Yeah, it's a good spot there for Adam Fox. Excited about that. So as we wrap up this episode, we're going to wrap up the Islander season real quick. And the New York Islanders this year, definitely, I went back last year and listened to our recap, and it's basically the same stuff. They lost to the Lightning. They were close to the finals, and they didn't get there, and they didn't have enough offense to get over the hump. Same scenario here. Their defense was great, but they came up short in a 1-0 game in Game 7.
Yeah, the only difference to me is the expectations. The Islanders kind of exceeded expectations the first couple years under Barry Trotz. This year, even though they had some good fortune on their way to the Eastern Conference Finals, the expectations were still a lot higher. They wanted to get over the hump this time. Unfortunately for them, I'm not going to complain, they weren't able to do that. Game 7 was a bit of an interesting game in terms of the Lightning kind of controlled most of it, but the only goal came when the Islanders had the only power play of the game. They missed, there was a miscommunication on a line change, and Yanni Gourde was able to score shorthanded and ended up being the only goal of the game and the end of the Islanders season. Definitely a tough end to a great playoff run for them, but they have some big decisions coming up in the offseason in terms of the expansion draft, the actual draft, their free agents on the roster. So I expect to see a lot of differences here going forward. They've had a long run with this core, and I expect there to at least be some peripheral changes. That not everyone's going to be back because they're already pretty strapped against the salary cap.
Yeah, they are pressed against the salary cap, and coming out after this, obviously, I don't love it, but you find out what players are going through. The end of season injury recap you get from just players that are battling through stuff, and then it comes out, whether it's Ben Bishop playing on a torn groin in the playoffs. I loved every second of that. Like, obviously, you don't want him to get injured or anything, but J.G. Pageau, who was on the Islanders, ended up having hand surgery. And I saw something funny on Twitter that came out that said, you look at J.G. Pageau, you know what they should do with him is stick him on the long-term IR and bring him back for the playoffs the way that the Tampa Bay Lightning did. But I don't believe that the Islanders have that much depth to where they can get back to the playoffs without Pageau put the puck in the back of the net.
Yeah, Pageau, wasn't much of a factor in that Lightning series. So I can't say I'm shocked that it turned out where he did have an injury, but kudos to him for playing through it. I think one question we got to ask is, is there a reason Oliver Wahlstrom was a scratch the entire series, especially as the Islanders struggled to generate offense in the later half of the series? Travis Zajac wasn't doing a whole lot, for example. And normally when your back's against the wall, you see teams make some lineup changes, but not trying to take away anything from Barry Trotz. But I do think that's a fair question to ask.
Yeah, that's a good point. Wahlstrom brings more offensively to your team, and you weren't getting anything from Zajac. And I was a big advocate saying Sajac's got to step up. I mean, he's a veteran. This is a playoffs. I don't care what he's done this season. He wasn't doing jack crap the entire season, but you finally put him back, and I thought he was going to be someone that steps up in the playoffs. He absolutely pissed down his leg, and he didn't do anything offensively.
No, and I mean, we knew that Palmieri was the centerpiece of that trade. And speaking of him, I'd be surprised if he comes back unless the Islanders end up losing, making a trade of Jordan Eberle or Anders Lee or somebody like that to clear space. They only have the financial room for so many people, and they have 3 restricted free agents, meaning they can match any offers another team gives them, although offer sheets are very rare in the NHL, of Beauvillier, Pelech, and Sorokin. They're going to be the 3 main priorities. And then, Palmieri, Casey Cizikas, they'll come next. So I definitely expect to see a lot of turnover with this team. I'm very curious to see what priorities they have in terms of in-house free agents, who they end up exposing and losing to the Kraken in the upcoming expansion draft. We'll talk about that in a few weeks, and going from there. But we know that they have raised the bar very high, and that the Islanders are going to be making moves to try to win a Stanley Cup. The question is, how much flexibility do they have to make moves to make that happen?
That's a good point. And one thing about this team before we wrap up, we know that they're going to be good. We know that they're in a situation, so it's not necessarily like a bad ending to where we're recapping something poor that happened. They couldn't get over the hump. That's simple as that. So next year they're still going to be in a great spot. It's sort of like a bittersweet ending because you know that you came so close to making it to the cup, but the Nassau Coliseum's a bye-bye. But other than that, this Islanders team is going to still be around. So they're still going to find a way to put some competitive hockey out there on the ice. So it should be fun to watch as the season goes on next year.
Yeah, congrats to them on a great run. I'm not going to lie and say that I'm not happy about how it ended, but they definitely deserve a lot of credit. There's a lot of mental toughness. They never quit, and I know that they're going to come back strong next year. So I'm very curious to see what happens there. We'll go from there, but give them a quick salute to a great season, and we'll address what they end up doing here in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah, so stay tuned here on the Big City Sports Podcast. Next week, I believe we're going to dive into some baseball. That's going to be big time. We haven't talked a big episode about baseball in a while. Plus, the Nets are done. The Islanders are done. I know we've been talking about them a lot these last few weeks. But other than that, we're going to dive into some baseball next week. And for Swig, make sure you check us out on the Big City Sports Podcast, both the YouTube page. Check us out, see our faces, like, subscribe, leave a comment. Also head over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, 5 stars, subscribe, and make sure you leave feedback on the Apple Podcast. Make sure you give us the rating and get some feedback. We definitely want to see how we covered the situation with the Blackhawks and everything that took place there, and also just how our episode went. So any sort of feedback's good feedback, as long as it's good feedback. But nah, we're good with any feedback. But other than that, for Swig, this is Dylan Kearns signing off the Big City Sports Podcast. We will see you next time.